Hey there, John. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm hanging in there. How are you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing okay. Welcome to the Glenn Show.
Pleasure to be here.
I am indeed Glenn Loury, Brown University Department of Economics and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. This is the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. And it's my pleasure to be talking with John Shields, who's Associate Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College out there in California, and author of a book, Trump's Democrats, that we are here to discuss. So, John, let me not try to tell people what this book is about. I think the title is very indicative of the general area of inquiry. You're trying to figure out who these Democrats are who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and what that all means for the future of American politics. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your project? The book is joint, I should say, with Stephanie
Moravcik.
Moravcik, I beg your pardon, Stephanie. But anyway, John, good to be talking to you about your book. What are you guys up to?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Well, the origins of this book, began on election night in 2016, and that was one of the most surprising political events of my lifetime, and really our surprise, really deepened in the weeks and days that followed because we discovered that there were many Obama counties, 206 of them, that flipped and voted for Trump. And as we dug deeper, we discovered that many of these places had not just voted for Obama, but they had been loyal to the Democratic Party for a long time. So, there's nearly 100 counties that had not voted for a Republican since the 80s. Others had not voted for a Republican president since 72, when they flipped for Reagan. And then there was a handful of places, Glenn, that had really pretty unbroken records of voting for Democratic presidential candidates stretching really back before the New Deal. In fact, there was one place, this is really astonishing, there was one place that had never voted for a Republican in the history of the county since it was formed in the 19th century. And, we're accustomed to talking about or thinking about the Nixon Democrats, and the Reagan Democrats, but the Trump Democrats are much more interesting because, Reagan and Nixon won in landslides. And so it's not surprising that there are a lot of places that flipped and, and a lot of Democratic places that voted for them. But in 2016, it wasn't a landslide. In fact, it was just the opposite, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and nonetheless managed to win some of the most loyal blue communities in the nation. And so to us, that was just a fascinating an interesting puzzle. And then the second thing I'll say really quickly by way of an introduction about the book is that there were the explanations that were floating around out there seemed to us really unsatisfying. And they all had, and we were unsatisfied with them because they all assumed that there's something must be deeply wrong with these people, right? They're either proto-fascist because they're authoritarian, or they're racist, or they have status anxiety, or they've got various diseases of social despair. And we wondered if the assumption that there must be something wrong with these voters was in part a symptom of our social and cultural isolation from these places. So we wanted to really we didn't begin with the assumption that there was some kind of psychological cleavage, right, that separated blue communities like the leafy college town we live in here in Claremont, and blue working class communities out there. We assumed that maybe there were some deep cultural differences between these places, and that might explain this divide that's opened up in blue America. And to understand culture, we really wanted to do something ethnographic and get out there. And so the book is partly a case for the importance of ethnography as well, especially in this era of social and class isolation.
Okay. So where'd you go? Who'd you talk to? What did you learn?
Yeah, we went to three places. We went to Ottumwa, Iowa, which is a small Rust Belt community and has a large meat packing plant. It's got a John Deere factory. It's a classic kind of union Rust Belt town. We went to Elliott County, Kentucky, which is a small rural community in Iowa. I'm sorry, it's a small rural community in Appalachia that's very, very isolated and small and poor. And then we went to Johnston, Rhode Island, which is, a spitting distance from where you sit now, Glenn.
Indeed.
Right? It's a suburb of Providence. It's very Italian-American.
Although, John, excuse me for interrupting, I should say, in keeping with your general narrative, I've never been there.
Of course you haven't.
It's a stone's throw up the highway, and I've never set foot in the place.
Yeah, no, right. So this isn't always big, giant geographic differences that account for our social isolation, right? So we went. It's an interesting point, right? So we went to Johnston, and all these places in some ways are different. They're economically different. They're different regions of the country. There's different urban geographies, but they also have certain things in common. They're all, incomes are modest. The percent of citizens with college degrees is low, and they're overwhelmingly white communities as well. Although some have experienced some immigration recently, including Johnston.
Excuse me, let me just ask a methodological question. How did you settle upon these particular sites?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, partly we wanted some diversity. And so all these places seem varied along some dimensions that I just mentioned. They're a little bit economically different. They were even ethnically a little bit different. We also had to pick places, frankly, Glenn, that we could get to. Some of these places are so remote that literally there would have been no place for us to stay, right? There's no hotel, there's no Airbnb. So that limited us to some degree. Some of these places would have been hard to do field work in unless we really knew someone in these communities. We wanted to pick places in different regions. But of course they're all deep blue places. They're all we wanted places that were really Democratic strongholds. So they're places that have been loyal to the Democratic Party for a long time, places where all the local officials are Democrats. We wanted places that were really one-party towns, and all these places fit that bill. Having said that, it could have been, there's some arbitrariness to this too, Glenn, right? It could have been different places. And so we have to think about the generalizability of our findings to other cases.
What do you do once you've decided you're going to go to Johnston, Rhode Island, and learn what Democrats who voted for blood? How do you even get started? Who do you talk to? You just walk into the diner and start chatting? I don't think so. I think you need a more coherent strategy. I don't do this kind of work, so it really interests me.
No, it's a great question. And one thing I really appreciate you, Glenn, as an economist, is that you have an appreciation for ethnography, which I've learned from watching your show. I wish more political scientists had some appreciation for this kind of work.
I have to thank Elijah Anderson for that, my dear friend,
yes.
who woke me up to the deep, deep importance of ethnographic inquiry.
Yeah, and we'll probably get to this later, but he was on my mind as we were doing some of this research because of honor culture, and I really first learned about honor culture through Elijah Anderson. So how did we do it? So we did have a method, and we began by contacting really local elites. So these are journalists, party leaders, clergy, union leaders. And from these different occupational perches, these people gave us a different angle of vision into these communities. But because they're well situated in the sort of social center of these places, they also were good at introducing us to just sort of more ordinary citizens in these communities. And then the other thing we quickly wanted to do is help identify a social center. A lot of these places have a place that people tend to gravitate around. In Johnston, for example, it's a local coffee shop called Brewed Awakenings. And I guess I don't know if that's a Rhode Island chain. There may be some down the street from you, I don't know. But there's two in Johnston, actually. But one is really the social center. In Elliott County, it was a Dairy Queen. So it was sort of finding, like, where do people sit around and chew the political fat and talk to each other, where you can not just interview people, but observe people. And that's really important, I think, if you want to understand the social norms of a place. And so anyway, that was more or less our message, our method, and that mostly worked. I mean, we found the hard place for us to get access to was Elliott County, Appalachia, where there was much more distrust of outsiders, and that took some time. They had a lot of distrust of, these academics on safari, coming into their community and wanting to poke around, which there's a long history of in Appalachia. And so that took a lot more. That took a lot more work. Johnston was easy, it was full of these Italian Americans who, wanted to tell us what they thought about all kinds of things. And so that was an easy community to penetrate and to study.
You guys did the interviews yourselves?
We did. We did the first case together. And I should say this too, Glenn, because it's, so Stephanie Moravchik and I are also married. So we did this kind of as a family, and so we studied Johnston together, which was our first case study, and then I did Iowa, and she did the case in Appalachia.
Okay, sounds very interesting. How were you received coming in? You say there was some skepticism in Appalachia. You guys, I guess, speak a different version of the English language than the locals do down there.
Yeah. It was hard. I mean, Stephanie, I'm glad she did Appalachia, because I think she would have had a lot more success at this than I would have had. Well, one thing she did is, her first trip there, we almost thought maybe we had to abort this case because nobody would talk to her. And as I mentioned, that was partly it's a very insular place, but there's also just a sort of history of distrust, and there had been some journalists there recently who had parachuted in and found, sort of a local crazy guy, and who everyone knew was sort of nuts, and interviewed him and profiled him in a national newspaper, and so we came on the heels of that experience.
Oh, and people were smarting about that because they felt embarrassed or poorly represented by that.
Yes. So they're very mindful of this, right? So they said things like, you all just think we're a bunch of rednecks, and that wasn't really a term even in our own vocabulary or minds, but it is very much in theirs. They feel looked down upon and misunderstood. And, they didn't want some PhD coming into their community and poking around and asking questions. And I'm not sure I could blame them. I mean, if I were them, I think some of that distrust is well earned. So we almost considered walking away from this project altogether. And but Stephanie went back a second time, and she did something really clever. She took our then 7-year-old son. And this was very humanizing because, it's a very familial place. And so to see her not just as a nosy academic, but as a mom, really softened them. And
this place in Appalachia went for Obama twice.
Twice, not just that, Glenn. It had never in its history voted for a Republican. Right? I mean, it's really extraordinary, right? I'm not sure in the history of, democracy, there's ever been a polity that has voted that consistently for one party, right? So it's a really sort of fascinating place. I also think it's the whitest community in the country that voted for Obama. Basically, there are no people of color in Elliott County, right? I mean, there's 6,000 people there, and they're all white. In fact, there's only a handful. I mean, most of the citizens there have a handful of surnames. It's a very it's a very homogenous place.
Yeah, I know how the cliche goes.
Right.
The slanderous cliche.
Yeah, you kind of know where that goes, right?
Yeah.
Right. So to outsiders, it seems kind of very inbred and incestuous, and right.
Okay, so this is ground zero for your inquiry. You want to know what happened in 2016. So what did you learn talking to these people?
Yeah, well, one of the things that really struck us is how familiar Trump really is in these places. A lot of the local political leaders there are Trumpian. They're brazen, they're thin-skinned, they're relentless counterpunchers, they're nepotistic. They're not especially ideological. The politics there is much more transactional. So they promise to cut deals and corners if needed to sort of take care of their people, and they expect respect. They expect perfect loyalty and respect in return. There's some history of corruption, political corruption in these places. It was. It's a, and this is for a lot of reasons, and maybe we could work through those, right? I mean, it's partly this is a political world that's been shaped by a tradition of honor culture. It's been shaped by a kind of familialism that's common in working class communities. It's been shaped by a history of boss politics, which persisted there much longer than it did in the major urban centers like Boston and Chicago. So in a funny way, to get a glimpse of these places was sort of like getting a glimpse of the old Democratic Party as it used to exist. And it's in the heyday of urban machines, but it's persisted there for longer, partly because again there's just been fewer foes. Fewer middle-class reformers who didn't like this kind of politics, and partly again because of its sort of working-class sensibilities and culture.
Wow. What about unions?
Yeah, so unions were strong in these places, but they're not. But they're weakened. I mean, and that's been certainly very true in Ottumwa. I mean, Ottumwa had a powerful tradition of militant unionism. There were the union rank and file at its meatpacking plant used to have wildcat strikes, and it was a very militant local.
This is the Iowa town.
This is the Iowa town, yeah. And
I was just thinking, I mean, union politics, Democrat. This is what I think. And so Even though you've got a cultural vector maybe pointing in one direction, why wouldn't the institutionalized political interests of the labor movement outweigh that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, well, partly it's because they're just much weaker, and so they don't have the muscle and political power that they used to have. And so they can't, they don't have the power to, the kind of political leverage and power that they used to have. But it's also true that Trump really spoke to the kind of economic concerns that have historically been at the forefront of unions. I mean, these folks are more protectionist than typical Democratic voters, for example. And so in some ways Trump is really sort of expressing the kind of concerns that have driven a kind of union, these union towns.
I see. Okay, well, so Hillary Clinton was calling these people deplorables. I'm wondering what the thinking was at the top of the Democratic Party that somehow didn't see coming this, I don't know what to call it, cultural backlash or whatever against the party. If it weren't Trump, it might have been someone else. There's Trump, but then there's also what was going on among the Democrats themselves vis-a-vis this component of their prior constituents.
Yeah, well, I think partly the Democrats had, sort of assumed that these places would continue voting Democratic, and that's not a crazy assumption. These are places. I mean, you look at a place like Elliott County. You don't. One doesn't think it's going to flip to the Republican Party, or that's true of the other places as well. So I think there was sort of just an assumption that these places would continue behaving as they have in the past. And I think what really flipped them in some ways was not just Democratic neglect, although I think that's a piece of it, but Democratic neglect is sort of an old story that had been going on a long time. What was new was really Trump. And I think he excited these folks in a way that no prior presidential candidate had. I mean, and there was a lot of evidence of this in the communities that we looked at. So, for example, in Johnston, where you should go visit at some point. There's a they were overwhelmed during the primaries because there were all these Democrats who wanted to switch their party registrations so they could support Trump in the primary. Right, so they were completely overwhelmed. There was a similar story in Ottumwa, Iowa.
Well, excuse me for interrupting.
Yes.
That would be something knowable before the November 2016 election. So a good analyst could have seen the warning flag in the primary registration behavior that would tell them that, oh my God, we might win Rhode Island, but what about Michigan? What about Pennsylvania?
No, I think it's true to a point, right? So I think it's a good observation, Glenn, right? So to a degree, I think that's right. Although the outcome still surprised a lot of the most knowledgeable locals there, right? I mean, people just didn't expect the kind of despite those early signs, there was still just a sense that these places just couldn't possibly go for Trump, and we heard that a lot. We heard local political elites tell us they just never thought it was possible, right? They didn't believe their town could flip because, again, it had been so solidly Democratic. So I think, yes, if they were really perspicacious and were really didn't sort of assume that these places would sort of keep doing what they had done, but there, in retrospect, that seems right. They should have taken these signs more seriously than they did.
What about Trump so appealed to these people?
Yeah, I mean, a part of it is he seems like they do and behaves like they do, and that's partly because Trump respects an honor culture. And if your listeners, I'll sort of briefly lay that out, right? So if your listeners don't know what that is, in an honor culture, it's very important to defend one's social reputation for toughness. So you can't let, if you're challenged or insulted, it's critical that one punches back and responds, right? You can't take Michelle Obama's advice, right? So when they go low, we go high. That's not going to work in an honor culture, because if you follow Michelle Obama's advice in this world, in an honor culture, you're going to be exploited, right? Because anytime you go high, it's always going to be read as a sign of weakness, right? A sign that you're not really capable of defending oneself. So it's a kind of culture that's common really throughout the world. It's common in much of the United States. It exists not just in white communities, but in Black and brown ones too. And where it doesn't exist is the kinds of places that lots of, urbane, educated Democrats live. It doesn't exist in college towns and highly educated neighborhoods and urban centers. I mean, it used to be more common, of course. The play Hamilton reminds us that, our political leaders used to kill each other in duels. But I'm
actually thinking of Jim Webb, more recently, the former senator, the Scotch-Irish inheritance that some argue very much manifested itself in the South and in Appalachia. Yep. You know.
Yep. Yes, and we associate it with the South, but it also exists in, in the Italian American community, in Providence and Johnston, and in Irish communities in Boston. It's common throughout the world. We and the nation. We sort of forget about it.
Sounds very male. Excuse me again for interrupting. It sounds very macho. Kind of patriarchal.
It is. I think that's right, but I think it does sort of appeal to, it's certainly men are expected, especially to be tough, but it's also one thing that struck us, Glenn, is that it's also admired by women too. Women are a lot tougher in these communities than one might think. For those who have read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, you'll get a flavor for this, right? Because his grandmother actually
lived. His pistol-packing grandmother.
Yeah, right. Who had a shotgun at 12, almost shot somebody at 12 because they were trying to steal the family cow, and then later she lit her husband on fire, when he had crossed her. It is a masculine style, but it's also, because it's a culture, it's a broader way of resolving conflict that's practiced by both genders. So we saw a lot of evidence of this culture in these places. We certainly saw it in its politics, in the local politicians who seem very Trumpian. And then we saw it in everyday life too, in the townspeople. And I'm happy to give some examples if you think that would be interesting.
But let me just make sure I'm understanding. This tendency to want to fight to defend my reputation for toughness, this not taking an insult without giving as good as I got. This toughness, this belligerence, really. You're identifying that as a fundamental trait of the culture of these places, which they saw reflected in the personality of Donald Trump, and which you argue accounts for their deviating from the long tradition of support for Democrats, because that attraction was so powerful to them.
Yeah, we think it's a factor, and we have, and there's a couple of kinds. There's a sort of theory here, but also, which I'll lay out, but also a kind of more empirical support for it. So on the theory side, a lot of voting is driven by a sense of social proximity. It's not so much driven by policy preferences or ideology, but by a sense that a candidate really speaks my language, right? And so Trump really seemed, I think, to a lot of the people we spoke with, like one of them, right? He shared this sort of working class sensibility, in way of sort of, sort of defending himself and pressing his interest. All of this seemed, Trump sort of felt like a working class candidate. In a way, I would say he's sort of, we say that he's really a kind of, arguably the sort of the most working class modern president, right? In the sense that he violated sort of the norms of the professional class. And one way he did that was through a kind of respect for this culture of honor. So we think that partly it's a kind of class-based identity that's going on here, right? There's a sense that, oh, he's one of us, right? This is how we talk on a Saturday night, which they sometimes said, right? Or he's part of our universe, and therefore we can trust him.
The thing that's puzzling me about that, though, is that in fact he's not a working class. He's a child of privilege. He was born with, how did Ann Richards say, a silver foot in his mouth. I mean, so did he know what he was doing? Did Trump just stumble into this, or was this a affectation of,
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and it's one we've only thought about recently because as interested as we are in Trump voters, we weren't interested in Trump, right? But then we had to think about Trump, and I think our sense of this, Glenn, is that he comes from privilege, but you don't want to think about class in just economic terms. I think that's really the wrong way to think about class. You also have to think about social class. And, he came from a family and moved in a world, sort of the real estate industry, world of, he had worked with sort of mobbed up, right, concrete companies and all the rest in Manhattan. It was a world that was also, I think, shaped by this culture to some degree. I think his mother is Scotch-Irish background. Our sense is that he grew up with this he grew up in a certain social class that happened to get wealthy. And this is actually true in the towns we looked at. I mean, there were people who were successful business people in these places. They had a family business that did pretty well. They weren't poor. By the standards of their community, they were well-to-do, but they all shared this social class, and it's why education in some ways is such a better marker of Trump voting than income, because education is a better marker of this class division that we're really trying to highlight in this book. And if you just think about class in economic terms, I think you miss, in many ways, the way in which this class divide has sort of played out. So. Yeah. So so Trump, he's rich, but he's. I mean, wouldn't you say, Glenn, that Trump is sort of seen in academic circles as kind of déclassé? I mean,
I mean, for example, he's stupid. The argument that he's stupid, which always befuddled me. People will get mad at me who are listening to this show right now for me not affirming that Trump is stupid. I don't think he's stupid. I don't see how you could have pulled off what he's pulled off and be stupid. He may be many things. He may be venal. He may be, wrong-headed. I mean, he may be a racist. I'm not saying he is or he isn't. He could be. But he's, in my opinion, stupid. That's way down the list of things that I would attribute. And yet people crow that he's an idiot. He's a jackass. He doesn't know his head from the hole in the ground. He's a blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't read. He doesn't read. They'll say things like that. And that does feel to me a little bit like playing a cultural card. He's not like us. He's not as refined as us. Look how Obama moved gracefully through the world. He'd feel very fine at a cocktail party on Martha's Vineyard. Trump wouldn't know what to say, etc. So yeah, I definitely see some of what you're getting at there.
Yeah, there's a crassness and crudeness to him, that I think is a marker of sort of the working class, and that and that just seems familiar to them, and it's in that sense, I think the stuff about the emphasis conservatives also place on political correctness sort of misses this a little bit. It's not like these are people who are tuned into, the concept of microaggressions or safe spaces or any of that stuff. What they see is a kind of someone who's flouting the norms of the professional class more broadly, which they feel alienated from.
But the crudeness sometimes leaks over into meanness and a kind of viciousness, even, shithole countries and, go back where you came from, kind of stuff like that.
Right.
Playing around with the belligerence and the honor stuff sometimes leaches over into almost seeming to foment or wink at that kind of behavior in your followers and things like that. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it does leak over in these communities too. I mean, the mayor of Johnston, we saw this in the mayor there. I mean, he holds court over a town hall meeting, and he's always greeted by a small group of citizens who really dislike his rule. And he just calls them malcontents and misfits and douchebags. It's not the
to the cheers of his supporters.
Yes, they appreciate this style. I think this is critical, right? So this is how one should handle conflict. and because that's what's respected, right? That's how you deal with someone who's given it to you, is you got to punch back, right? And you can't be magnanimous. That's always going to be read as weakness. And so, yeah, I mean, occasionally we heard someone in Johnston say things like, gee, I wish he wouldn't curse at old ladies so much. So at the margins, they there's kind of some excesses to it, but you can appreciate something even if you think it can be, if there's excesses, right? You think, well, we basically like that style.
So I'm thinking back to some of these rallies early in the 2016 campaign and then in the administration, where the protesters would be protesting and Trump would say, get them out of here.
Yes.
Exactly. Whatever. Or where he's giving that speech to the police union fraternity or whatever, and he says, don't be too gentle when you put them into the patio, this kind of thing. You're saying that's a calculated move to appeal to a certain sentiment in a critical part of the electorate that he needs to win the...
It's a good question. I don't know how calculated it is.
Okay.
But I do think it might be just authentic to Trump. I mean, I think he's really a believer in this style. I mean, he once told, this is chronicled in Bob Woodward's first book on him, Fear. Woodward, says that Trump once said something to the effect like, real power is fear. You can't ever show weakness, never get back down. There is no choice, right? So for Trump, there's strong people and there's weak people. And there's really, and the question is always, are you a strong person or are you not? I think it explains why he's gravitated to strong men around the world. For example, I think that's, I think for Trump too, there's no other style of leadership, and it may come at his political expense now, right? I mean, this kind of style plays well in the communities we visited, but it doesn't play so good so well in the suburbs, So I don't know that he can. I don't know that Trump seems sort of trapped by this honor culture too in some ways. He doesn't seem to be. There's not a lot of nimbleness there, sort of ability to sort of, nod toward other kinds of cultural sensibilities that are out there. The second quick thing I'd say, Glenn, is I think it's a really good point you're making about the rallies, and one of the things that really struck us is this honor culture works a lot better locally than it does nationally. I mean, Trump really has tried to import this culture into our national politics, and it doesn't import well. It works a lot better locally because citizens have a lot of social knowledge in those contexts. They kind of know who not to mess with. They can sometimes intervene. We saw this to give another example from Johnston. I mean, there was a fight that nearly broke out at the local coffee shop there, a political fight between a Clinton supporter and a Trump supporter. But there was a third person who intervened because he knew both would be combatants, right? He knew both parties and sort of vouched for him and said, hey, you're a nice guy, let's talk this out. But when you get large rallies, and it's basically a group of strangers, that same kind of culture doesn't, where there's a lot of strangers, just, it can't moderate. Conflicts tend to go straight to violence. There's no sort of social knowledge and intimacy that can help sort of de-escalate those conflicts. So it's a culture that really doesn't work well at the national level. And one of the terrible things we think that Trump has done is sort of imported this sort of local culture into the national orbit. We'd say the same thing is true of nepotism. Nepotism isn't so bad in small towns, doesn't work so well, at the national level.
I'm just thinking about that point. That seems very interesting to me. On the one hand, the imperative at the level of an individual to maintain a reputation for toughness, don't mess with me. On the other hand, that could lead to a lot of unnecessary conflict unless modulated by some other forces or customs or practices. But in order to cultivate these mitigating conflict diminishing norms and practices, we need to know each other.
Right.
300 million people can't know each other in the same way. What you say on CNN or from the White House with a tweet, which goes out to 100 million people, is a different thing than what you say in a bar when you've got a beef with somebody because he sat on your regular bar stool.
Yep.
Kind of thing like that. That's all very interesting.
And you see this, Glenn, in a book that I know you're a fan of, Elijah Anderson's Code of the Street.
I do love that book, yes.
It's an excellent, excellent book. And one of the many great insights in that book is the ways in which the Code of the Street, can sometimes control violence too, limit it. There's a way in which it can, because there is all this social knowledge and intimacy. And I guess the final thing I'd say on this, Glenn, is that, there's a lot of the critics of Trump accused him of violating the norms of politics. But what he really did is he violated the norms of our national politics. And, if you look at a lot of these local communities, politics is much more Trumpian. And so Trump doesn't seem so odd in these places. And so if we dismiss him, as just this sort of disordered kind of crazy person, we miss all the ways in which he behaves totally normally, in a lot of sort of local context. And I think that's important thing to keep in mind as we're trying to make sense of his appeal.
Okay, well, here's the question that I have to ask. What about race?
Yes.
Okay, these people voted for Obama in these counties that you're talking about. So I want to say they're not racist. They could get behind Obama. On the other hand, they flip and they vote for Trump, and Trump is well known to be, quote unquote, a racist. Why is it that Trump's racism didn't turn them off? Or did their votes for Obama really betray something more egalitarian or open about race? Or was it a fluke, something like that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, we think there may be some. I mean, we certainly don't want to dismiss the claim that race was a factor. I mean, I guess we just wish there would be more intellectual humility on the part of those who insist that race was everything. That's what we're not really persuaded by. I mean, I think one of the takeaways from our book is that white identity cannot be these folks' only social identity, right? They're much more three-dimensional than that. And it can't be their only identity, partly because of the reason you just gave. It doesn't really explain, why they would vote for Obama twice if they were merely, white identity was sort of their only sort of central and only important kind of political and social identity. So we think they're much more three-dimensional. I mean, I think that in addition to however much they identify as white people, they also have these strong class-based identities. They're also really connected to their place, and we also talk about this in the book. They really deeply identify as Ottumwans and Johnstonians and Elliott Countyans. Their sense of self and identity in some ways is really it's really deeply connected to that town, and it's really, and when I tell this to some of my colleagues, Glenn, they sometimes say, well, Democrats in Boston they care about where they live, they're good neighborly people, they're good localists. And that's true as far as they go, but those people in Boston, in Brookline, Massachusetts, for example, they would be equally at home, in Old Town Alexandria or in Palo Alto, California, or in Claremont, right? But
the Boston Democrats who live in Southie would not be.
That's right, right? So that's right. So, the Johnstonians we studied would be totally out of place in Elliott County, and the Elliott Countyans would feel totally out of place in Ottumwa, because the place they live is really where they're socially known, right? It's the place where they have a reputation, where they have deep family ties, where really whole social identity is centered. I think it's sort of the opposite for the professional class, right? Like if you went and took a job at Harvard, right, you might, or if I did, right, that would enhance our social reputation. Whereas for them to leave their hometown would be a kind of social death. They would be disconnected from the community and place that gives them a sense, that gives them, really anchors them. And very poignantly, you see this in Elliott County, where streets are named after their families, or all their dead are buried on their property. So in addition to these racial identities, I guess, Glenn, we would also say that they have deep sense of class and place. And we don't know really for sure, how to weigh these various factors. That is, and that's partly because political scientists really haven't tried to measure a lot of this stuff. If you look at the National Election Survey, there's a ton of questions on race, but no really effort to measure people's place-based identities. There's no effort to measure their sense of social class. But our intuition, based on our research, is that our impression, based on our impressionistic work, is that race is overstated. That there's been too much emphasis on this, and we don't think it really. In a way, right? Maybe this is the last thing I'll say. In a way, white identity, white America is almost too broad a category, right, to capture their identities. Their identities in some ways are more provincial in certain ways, like they're Ottumwans, or they're Johnstonians.
Or they're hunters, or they're Catholics. I'm asking, is religion a part of it? Or are the social issues, the Second Amendment, abortion, etc.?
It's a lot weaker than we anticipated. First of all, the church is weakening in all these places. So these are communities that are secularizing fast, and the church is, the church in all these places in some ways I also don't want to describe these. We also don't want to describe these places as culturally homogenous, right? The church in some ways is really sort of pushing against these local honor cultures too, right? Because the church says good Christian men should turn the other cheek, and all that stuff. So there's but the church is weakening there, as are unions, and that's relevant too, because a lot of the commentators on these folks said, oh, they voted for Trump because they're so alienated, from all these civic institutions, which used to sort of give them a sense of identity. And I do think they're worried about the decay of these institutions, but it's precisely because they're not alienated from the places they live, right? They care about them, and they're worried about their fate. And Trump came along and said, I'm going to make America great again. And when they heard that, what they really heard is, I'm going to make Ottumwa great again, and I'm going to make Elliott County great again. And, that kind of restorationist rhetoric resonated in communities that are facing existential threats, right? There are worlds in which a lot of the young people have left. Yeah. There's a concern that they'll be able to just sustain these communities, which are so important to their sense of self.
Okay, I know you got to go, John, but I gotta do this to you. I'm sorry. We're talking here a few days on the Thursday before Election Day, but the viewers are not going to see this until after the election. So can he do it again?
Well, it doesn't look that way, right?
That's what the polls are telling me, but they said the same thing last time.
Yeah, right. I've underestimated him from the beginning, and he's consistently proven me wrong. So it's been humbling in some ways to make predictions about Trump and his political prospects. I suspect that Biden will win, and he probably will claw back some of the kinds of folks we studied. But our guess is that a lot of the places we studied will vote for Trump again. And I think, and so if that happens, the bigger question on our mind is sort of what kind of lessons do Democrats take away from this? What if they win, despite the fact that they lose a lot of these Obama-Trump counties, they might then decide, well, gee, I guess we don't need these folks after all, right? And who wants them because they're kind of deplorable and racist, and it'd be better, we'll just kind of wash our hands of them and worry about, and they're declining anyway, and
You think that would be a mistake?
I think for two reasons. I think one is, first of all, although they're in decline, they're very well represented in the kinds of states that Democrats need to win presidential elections. But also they have to worry about, not everything is about the White House, and they need to, if you're a Democrat, seems to us, you need to worry about, your influence in state and local governments. But I also think, and I guess this is the bigger thing for us too, Glenn, is that the Democrats, there's a lot of ways they can win this election, and they might well win, by just increasing turnout among suburbanites and racial minorities, but they still have to ask themselves a kind of more existential question, which is what kind of party do they want to be, right? Do they still want to be a party, a broad-based party of the working class, and try to reassemble, right, the sort of New Deal party, a party that was rooted in the American working class? And to do that, they have to start. That's a big. If they really do want to, become that kind of party, they've got a lot of work ahead of them. And it seems to us the place to start is at least start with the places that, were basically voting their way until yesterday. Places where still a lot of the local politicians are Democrats, and therefore, of course, they should buy and read our book.
Well, I hope should the Democrats win, they do that. I'm smiling here because I'm thinking your question, what kind of party do the Democrats want to be, is a question that many people will have been putting to the Republican Party for a while now. What kind of party? And whatever happens in this election, both parties are going to be thinking in a very deep way about whether our party for the future. Anyway, John, thanks. I know you got to go. Glenn Loury here with John Shields, who teaches politics at Claremont, McKenna, and whose book with Stephanie Moravchik is Trump's Democrats. Definitely not too late to read it before the election. Actually, yes, it is, because we're past the election. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Glenn. I appreciate it.